Covenant at Shechem, Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 to 35. This is a short episode treating of a covenant that Joshua performs with the nation in the vicinity of the city of Shechem on Mount Aval. It's quite surprising in the context of the narrative in the book of Joshua, which treats the conquest and wars, and suddenly, according to our version, Masoretic text, we find this covenant in the midst. So let us first read the small episode and then also discuss its location within the book of Joshua, according to the different versions, as we will elaborate. So verse 30, then Joshua built an altar to the Lord God of Israel on Mount Aval, just to help you locate geographically. So we are here, you can see in Google Maps, this is the vicinity of Shechem, the city of Shechem, and here you can see Shechem. It's called Nablus by the Arabs. Nowadays, that's the later name given, its colonialist name given by the Romans after they conquered the city. But the original name is Shechem, and it is still used by Israelis in Hebrew. So next to Shechem, which is in Samaria, northern Samaria, we have the Mount of Aval. Here you can see the altar, Mount Aval. This is a little north of the city of Shechem, northeast of the city of Shechem, and going a little south of the city, we have the other mountain, the Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans still dwell today, next to the town of Bracha. In any event, so they go up north, and let's return to our text. As Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones upon which no man has lifted up any iron. So we see that Joshua is performing this act of building an altar on the Mount Aval, right, following the command of Moses, as it is written in the book of the Torah, that one is to build an altar of whole stones, in other words, stones that were not hewn by iron tools, and they offered upon it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And he wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, the Torah of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. And all Israel and their elders and officers and their judges stood on this side of the ark and on that side before the priests, the Levites, the bearers of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native born, half of them over against Mount Gerizim, that was the southern mountain, and half of them over against Mount Aval, northern one, north of Shechem, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded to bless the people of Israel first. And here we once again see the emphasis that this is following the command of Moses. And afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. Again, right, pointing out that the source is from the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the congregation of Israel, with the woman and the little ones and the strangers that walked among them. So this is the short episode, the covenant involving the construction of an altar, the offering of sacrifices, the writing of Torah on stones, and the reading of Torah before the whole congregation, all the people. Now, in the Masoretic version, what we have just read, this appears at the end of chapter 8, right following the victory over the eye. But what's interesting is that this very same episode appears in different places according to different texts that we have, manuscripts of the book of Joshua. For example, a second location, which is very close to this one, is found in the Old Greek translation that places this not in chapter 8, but rather in chapter 9, after verse 2. In other words, we have two verses in the beginning of chapter 9, the next chapter, that deal with the rest of the nations hearing what occurred. Here we can take a look and see the beginning of chapter 9, that the kings that were on this side of the Jordan, they heard and they gathered together. And then in the Old Greek, then we have the description of the covenant at Shechem. So that's one option with a slight variation of two verses, but a more radical difference is found in the most ancient manuscript that we have of Joshua, and that is from the manuscripts of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have in the scroll 4Q Joshua A, that stands for Cave 4, and the manuscript of Joshua, the first manuscript A of Joshua. There, interestingly enough, we find this very episode located well earlier in chapter 5, immediately following the crossing of the Jordan, before the fulfillment of the command to circumcise the Israelites and celebrate Passover. So that is quite a difference in location. The variations here, both the Old Greek, which is slight, and the greater difference in the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, the fact that there's so many variant locations of this episode has led many scholars to claim that this is a later insertion into the book of Joshua, and hence there were differences in where it was inserted. And most scholars believe this is a Deuteronomistic insertion. In other words, a later stage in the redaction by the Deuteronomist who placed it where he placed it. As far as the variations and the reasons for these differences, well, we can definitely understand the variation found in Qumran, which is probably the easiest text, and therefore probably the latest of the versions, where the Masoretic text is very likely quite original. And somebody decided to shift this episode earlier to an earlier portion of the book of Joshua, namely right away in the beginning of chapter 5, following the crossing of the Jordan. Why would somebody shift it? And that's why probably this is the later version, because it's unlikely that it would be shifted away. Because to a large extent, and particularly if we consider this to be a Deuteronomistic addition, we can find a very good reason for its relocation earlier on in the book. And that we can understand based on the sources that relate to the command, which are actually also mentioned in our chapter itself. There is constant reference to as is written in the book of Moses, and it is indeed written in the book of Moses. The issue of setting up an altar and blessing the Israelites next to Mount Aval is located in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's Mount Aval itself, and a command relating to it is found twice in the book of Deuteronomy. once in chapter 11, where God says that as they reach the land, they are to present a blessing and a curse exactly in Mount Aval. Take a look at we'll begin this is chapter 11, verse 26. Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing that you will heed the commandments of the Lord, your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you will not heed the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn away from the way I command you this day to follow other gods which you did not know. And it will be, when the Lord your God will bring you to the land to which you come to possess it, that you shall place those blessings upon Mount Gerizim, and those cursing upon Mount Aval. And are they not on the other side of the Jordan, way beyond, in the direction of the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites, who dwell in the plain opposite Gilgal, near the plains of Moreh? I would prefer translating near the oaks of Moreh. For you are crossing the Jordan to come to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall possess it and dwell it, and you shall keep to perform all the statutes and ordinances that I am setting before you today. So here we have an explicit command to bless and curse the Israelites on these two mountains, Gerizim and Aval. A more elaborate and closer connection to what we find in the book of Joshua, we read later in Deuteronomy chapter 7. And there we read as follows. And it will be, on verse 2, and it will be on the day that you cross the Jordan to the land the Lord your God is giving you, that you shall set up for yourself huge stones and plaster them with lime. When you cross, you shall write upon them all the words of this Torah, in order that you may come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you. And it will be, when you cross the Jordan, that you shall set up these stones, which I command you this day, on Mount Aval, and you shall plaster them with lime, and there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield any iron upon them. You shall build the altar of the Lord your God out of whole stones, and on it you shall offer up burnt offerings to the Lord your God. And you shall slaughter peace offerings, and you shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. You shall write upon the stones all the words of this Torah very clearly. So here we have the command to build an altar, to offer the sacrifices, and to write upon the stones, the Torah very clearly. And so here we see Joshua is actually, as written in the chapter, performing the commandments that were already prescribed to Moses earlier on in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, how does this relate to the location in which we find the episode in the book and the different variations? Well, that we can understand based on the comparison of these commands that we see in Deuteronomy to their actual performance in the book of Joshua. So we can find, in general, there's definite correlations and similarities, particularly if we can also bring in chapter 11. So we see all the components of altar sacrifices, writing the Torah, and a blessing and a curse. Slight differences as far as the ordering that we find, where it changes. We see first the emphasis on the building of the altar, and then writing of the Torah, and then flipped over. We also see that in the actual performance in the book of Joshua, when they build the altar, that's how it begins. So they don't mention the issue of plastering with lime. That might just be a technical detail that was left out. And we don't have the explicit mentioning of reading the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, just the writing of the Torah. And maybe that's because it's clear that after they write, they read the Torah. But perhaps the most dramatic difference that we find is the timing, because in the commandments, we see both in 11 and particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 27, when is all this supposed to be performed? So let's go back to verse 2. On the day that you cross the Jordan, that's when it's supposed to be performed. And indeed, the ancient commentators, the sages, really grappled with this question, because in the book of Joshua, as we have it, the whole covenant is performed only after they conquered Jericho and after their second and finally successful attempt at conquering the Ai. They didn't do it immediately upon crossing the Jordan. And so the rabbis grapple, and it's interesting to see some of the quite, I would say, creative opinions that arise amongst the rabbis. For example, one opinion that is found in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate of Sotah, page 36, that on the very day that they crossed the Jordan, right, they reached Har Grizim, they met the Mount of Grizim, and they basically walked 60 miles, right, to make it to the Mount of Grizim. Pretty much I'd say a great and unrealistic distance if you're considering that they walked with the whole people, including all the women and children, in order to say, okay, the day that they crossed, they reached and performed that covenant. That's one opinion that we find amongst the ancient sages that obviously doesn't correlate with what we find in the text, which places, according to our tradition, the event only at the end of chapter 8. The second interesting opinion is that no, they performed the whole covenant and ceremony next to the Jordan River, not going to the mountains of Grizim and Aval, but next to two mounds, which they called Grizim and Aval, which is obviously an attempt to satisfy the command of doing it immediately upon crossing, and also, but the reality that it's too far. So that kind of shifts it away and says, no, they performed it next to the Jordan River, but that's of course not the command. And we see in the book of Joshua, no, that they actually made it to Shechem. So these are all, I would say, difficult readings, that they made it in one day or that they did it next to the Jordan. They don't correlate with what we find in the book. Another opinion is that of a Rabbi Yishmael, that, and this is also found also in the Jerusalem Talmud, in tractate Sotah, not in the Babylonian, but in the Jerusalem Talmud. And there a Rabbi Yishmael says that the whole covenant was performed after the 14 years of conflict, after all the wars and the conquest of the land. Namely, that would delay the covenant much more, and also place it far further in the book of Joshua, not in chapter 8, but rather after chapter 12, pretty much. We don't have an extant manuscript locating the covenant there. What we do have, which is quite interesting, is the book of Josephus, Antiquities. And there in book 5, basically Antiquities, Josephus was the originally Galilean Jewish fighter and commander in the rebellion against the Romans, who basically crossed sides and became a historian, eventually going back to Rome. And he writes the history of the Jews. And we have in his Antiquities, in book 5, we find indeed that only after all the conquests was the covenant performed. Here you could see on 19, the 5th year was now passed, and there was not one of the Canaanites remained any longer, excepting some that had retired to places of great strength. So Joshua removed his camp to the mountainous country and placed the tabernacle in the city of Shiloh, etc., etc. And from thence he went to Shechem, together with all the people, and raised an altar where Moses had beforehand directed. Right? And so we see that that's the reading of Josephus. Perhaps it represents a manuscript that he had. We no longer have it. Or he maybe just thought logically it doesn't make sense to make a covenant in the midst of a conquest and a war. But in any event, that is another option, and actually delays even further the fulfillment of the command. So we see those who want to, some of the ancient sages who said, no, it was performed right away on the first day, whether reaching Shechem miraculously or doing it next to the river, the Jordan River, and those who delay it. And this brings us to the extant manuscript that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which placed the performance of the covenant right after crossing the Jordan. We can clearly understand it now. Why so? It's obvious that the goal of that was to correlate between the original command that this should be done when they crossed the Jordan, and therefore it was moved. The whole event was moved earlier on, right after the crossing of the Jordan. But as far as reality is concerned, the Masoretic text seems quite plausible, because in order to reach Shechem, they have to make some inroads into the mountainous area, and that's what they did. So maybe the command was, okay, you could do it, you should do it when you cross the Jordan. That's the ideal. This is something that has to be done as quickly as possible upon entry into the land. And realistically speaking, that means they did it once they had some access into the mountainous area, and that required at least some conquests, going westerly, conquering Jericho and controlling the Jordan Valley, and then going inland to the Ai, up the mountainous area. And then they perhaps were able to make access to Shechem, which for some reason or another did not wage war with them. And indeed, we don't have a mention of Joshua conquering Shechem, and that could be because maybe there were certain relations between the residents of Shechem and some ties between them and the Israelites, which is a possibility. Perhaps even some of the descendants of Joseph may have remained there or left earlier, left Egypt earlier, as found in other areas in the Bible. But if there is some logic to what we have in our text and the placement of the episode where it is after the Ai. So we read about the event itself. We've discussed the location and some of the tensions as far as the command, and explained that there might have been an ideal and the reality of what actually happened. And we also explained how there are different versions that probably grew out of this tension. Now let's try to grapple with some of the more central questions relating to this episode. And let's begin with the the issue of what was written on the rocks. They had to build an altar, right, and offer sacrifices. It's very interesting that the sacrifices that were offered were also a burnt offering and a peace offering. So we see kind of like an event that shows, on the one hand, burnt offering, everything is burnt and goes up to God. That's an expression of fear. And on the other hand, the peace offering, where the offer also eats part of the sacrifice, and it's kind of like a feast with God, a sense of closeness to God. And we also see that the event involved all the people, right? And the text emphasizes, if we go back to it, that all the people were involved, and even the strangers, right, came in. And after they offered the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, and we see that even the stranger, as well as the native born, were there. And at the end, we're also informed that all of the congregation of Israel, with the woman and the little ones, this is an event that encompassed everyone. The double emphasis on the stranger, right, in the beginning and the end, shows how even though the Israelites are in conflict with the residents here, but if there are strangers that join the Israelites, they aren't Jews from birth, but the congregation was accepting of them and even allowed them to partake in this ceremony. There's an emphasis on letting them be part of this ceremony. And this is something we also find in the Torah, where even the stranger is invited to partake in Passover, so long as he's circumcised. The ger, the stranger, also joins. And this event, which involves the offering of sacrifices, also involves the writing of the Torah, right? Let's see the verse again. After he builds the altar and offers the sacrifices, he writes in verse 32, he wrote upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, right? In the Hebrew, al-havanim, he writes on the rocks, et Mishneh Torat Moshe, a copy of the law of Moses. Which rocks are we talking about? So there is an opinion amongst the sages that these are the rocks that they took out of the Jordan, but that doesn't suit the language here. As far as the text is concerned, it could theoretically be, as one of the rabbis suggested, that these are the rocks that were used to build the altar, right? Notice the emphasis on the rocks, that they have to be whole stones. And the commandment, nobody could have viewed and shaped the stones. No iron is allowed to be used. This is a command that we read earlier on, and also appears even in the book of Exodus, where it explicitly stated that if you build an altar, and you have to build, either you make an altar from earth, right? But if you make an altar from stones, this is in Exodus chapter 20, when you make me an altar of stones, you shall not build them of hewn stones, lest you wield your sword upon it. In other words, you have to use natural stones that weren't hewed and shaped by iron. This is a limitation indeed. We know when King Solomon built the temple, he did not use, not only for the altar, which is what is explicitly mentioned in the Torah, the whole construction did not involve the use of iron tools, at least not in the temple itself. This may be a desire to stay away from things that bring about destruction and death, iron tools, and therefore the elaboration that you have to use whole stones that weren't hewed by iron tools. So might be that they also wrote on the altar, but more likely, and I think this makes the most sense, that they wrote the Torah on rocks on the mountain. Now the question is, what was written when they say, right, that Joshua had to write upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses? What are we talking about? And here there are really different opinions. In fact, we'll bring 5 different opinions about what was written on the rocks. And in my opinion, we're talking about the rocks on the mountain of Aval there. And for that, let us share screen, and I'll show you the different opinions. Here we go. So we'll order them according to not chronological order, but rather from the most minimalist to the most expansive. So we'll begin with Abarbanel. Abarbanel was originally from Portugal, lived in the 15th century, and it's usually pronounced, by the way, not Abarbanel, but Abarbanel is the more precise pronunciation. Anyway, so he was a fascinating person. First of all, with great knowledge, also very knowledgeable in economics. He was made the Minister of Finance, if you will, under the monarchy in Portugal, and had to escape there when trouble began to strike the Jews. Then he went to Spain, and even there, once again, eventually the Jews are forced to leave, and he has to escape as well from Ferdinand and all of the atrocities and problems facing the Jews in the Inquisition, and eventually gets to Italy. And even there, he's made like a finance minister. And he also managed in all these troubles to be, besides a minister of finance under different kings, to write a fascinating interpretation. And in Joshua, in his interpretation to Joshua, his suggestion here is that what was written on the rocks were the 10 Commandments. So that's one option. That, of course, would be very minimalistic as far as what was written. And the reasoning, the logic is very clear, because you're saying, okay, it's not easy to start chiseling and writing, even if it was on plaster, right? How much can you write? So the Abarbanel says, okay, the basics, the 10 Commandments. Another suggestion is raised by Rasag. That's Rabbi Saadia Gaon. He's very early, the end of the 9th, beginning of the 10th century, originally from Egypt, then he moves to Babylon, to Persia. And he suggests, what is the Torah? It can't be the whole Torah, he says, so maybe it encompasses all the commands of Moses. So maybe there was a list, and according to the tradition, there are 613 commandments, so he proposes that there was a list of the different commandments. Ralbag, that stands for Rabbi Levi ben Gershom. He is from southern France, from the area of Provence, in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. He proposes something which I think may be closer, and even perhaps closest amongst the commentators, to the simple understanding that we're talking about the blessings and the curses. That was what was written on the text, because this is a ceremony that involved, first of all, the command to bless the Israelites. We see that explicitly in Joshua, where it is said that Joshua afterwards read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse. So he read it maybe, and that's also what was written. And in fact, when we look at Deuteronomy and the command for writing, building the altar and writing upon the stones the words of this Torah, and we find right afterwards, in that same chapter, we're talking about Deuteronomy chapter 27. So right following that, there's an elaboration. When we say, and Moses commanded the people on that day, saying, when you cross the Jordan, the following shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. The following shall stand upon Mount Aval for the curse. Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zvulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites shall speak up, saying to every individual of Israel in a loud voice, cursed be the man who makes any graven or molten image, an abomination to the Lord, the handiwork of a craftsman, and sets it up in secret. And all the people shall respond, saying, Amen. Cursed be who degrades his father and mother. And all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who moves back his neighbor's landmark. And all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who misguides a blind person on the way. And all the people say, Amen. Cursed be he who perverts the judgment of the stranger, the orphan, or the widow. And all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he who lies with his father's wife, thus uncovering the corner of his father's garment. And all the people shall say, Amen, etc., etc. A list of curses, transgressions that people make. Probably the common denominator behind them is that they are things that are performed perhaps secretly, right, in your home. Sexual misconduct. He who lies with his sister, with his mother, with his who strikes his fellow in secret, as we see later on, verse 24, who takes a bribe to put an innocent person to death. All these things are done, right, covertly. And so there's a pronouncement in front of all the people, right, out loud, that a curse shall come upon them. So that's the aspect of the curse. As far as the blessing, well, in this chapter, we don't have a blessing. Some have proposed that, well, what happened is, blessed he who does not do this, even though it's not explicitly stated. And then they say, okay, the Torah didn't elaborate, but the blessing was whoever doesn't do these things shall be blessed. Or an alternative is to continue in the next chapter. There we find blessings as well as curses. So it could be, but what we do see is that in tandem in chapters 27, 28, we have the ceremony in the mountains and also an issue of a curse and a blessing. And that is probably what lies behind Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, also known as Gershonides, his opinion that that what was written here were the blessings and curses. A fourth opinion is, that's the earliest of all, is the famous Tana, the sage, living in the 2nd century in Israel, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says that what was written was the book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Deuteronomy, the 5th of the books in the Torah of the Pentateuch. And how did he get to Deuteronomy? Well, the terminology used in the command is to write a copy, in Hebrew, Mishneh Torah, a copy of the Torah of Moses. And one of the names given to the book of Deuteronomy, even amongst the sages, is a copy of the Torah, Mishneh Torah. Deuteronomy is also called, you could hear it in the also the Latin name, Deuteronomos, Deutero, the second law, right? So it's like a copy of the law. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai suggested that maybe the book of Deuteronomy was written. So that would be a lot more expansive. Deuteronomy is a whole book. That's far more than the first 3 opinions, but it's still not the whole Torah. The most expansive position is that of the famous scholar Ramban, known also as Nachmanides, or Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. He's originally from Spain, lived primarily in the 13th century, made Aliyah to Israel as well, and died in Israel. And he suggests that it was the whole Torah. What others were hesitant to say, because they felt writing the whole Torah on rocks, that sounds totally unrealistic. However, we can say in light of modern archaeological finds that maybe this is not so ridiculous as an option. I mean, we know that Codex Hammurabi, which was pretty lengthy, right, over 200 laws, that appeared on one stela, on one rock. So maybe it's not so far-fetched, and there are certain later scholars who definitely say they don't rule it out as a possibility. Of course, it's something that would probably take a long time to write. You'd need a lot of people working on it. But that is also the most expansive of the possibilities. So as we can see, there are different suggestions as to what was written. I think as far as the text is concerned, perhaps the closest to the simple understanding would be Ralbag, who connected it to the blessings and the curses that appear. That is perhaps what is meant by the Torah. This is the teaching that Moses gave as keeping of the Torah will determine whether one will be blessed or cursed. In any event, whatever was written, we have to understand what is the significance of this of this whole ceremony, and why was it performed, why was it commanded in the book of Deuteronomy and appears in the book of Joshua. So perhaps let's start by asking, this event, is it at all reminiscent of some other event that we can think of? Writing Torah on rocks, on a mountain, with sacrifices being offered, reading Torah out loud, saying the Torah out loud, with the whole people present. Well, for those who are familiar, I think what immediately comes to mind is, of course, the covenant at Mount Sinai, the giving of the Torah and the Ten Commandments. In fact, I think that maybe is what was behind Abarbanel's suggestion that what was written were the Ten Commandments. Because when we compare these two events, well, here as well, what do we see? A mountain, right, with all the people there, and a leader. This time it's Joshua, who's writing the Torah. By the way, Moses also wrote the Torah. It's explicitly stated in the book of Deuteronomy. And we hear the Torah out loud before the people. Also, Moses, after the first two commandments, Moses said the rest of the commandments before the people. And here Joshua reads out the Torah before the people. And in fact, in Exodus chapter 24, we also read about the building of an altar and the offering of sacrifices. Right, the covenant itself at Mount Sinai was in Exodus chapter 20, and then the covenant with the altars is in chapter 24. So this is, I think, the immediate correlation that comes to mind. There's so many parallels here, and therefore, perhaps that is one of the significances and ideas that are behind this ceremony. It's obvious that this ceremony is emphasizing the importance of keeping Torah, right? That's clear. And the understanding that they're holding onto the land and being victorious is dependent upon their being faithful to Torah. But there seems in this action, which was emphasized to have to take place upon crossing the Jordan, namely as quickly as possible, seems to correlate with the original covenant at Mount Sinai. And if that's the case, then we can propose, even if you don't accept the Abarbanel suggestion that it was the Ten Commandments, definitely if you do, that the Ten Commandments were written on the rocks. But even if you don't, we can propose that this is actually a bringing the covenant that took place in the desert on Mount Sinai, bringing it into the land and connecting it to the land of Israel. And therefore, it's like an ongoing process where this is the opening covenant prior to entering, that was in Mount Sinai, and its actual implementation in the land upon entry, right? And hence, the emphasis that has to be done as quickly as possible upon entering, because this is the condition for entering. You can enter the land on condition that you keep the Torah and you fulfill that covenant as it was performed on Mount Sinai. So we took the Torah that was written on the tablets at Mount Sinai, and now we bring that Torah and write it down on the rocks in the land. And then basically we have the fulfillment of that whole cycle, if you will, of bringing the Torah into the land. It had to be given beforehand because it's prior necessity and condition for the land. And once you enter the land, what you have to do as early as possible is connect it to the land, bring the Torah to the land. Now, ideally, and that's why the Torah commanded when you cross the Jordan, to do it. Now, realistically, you had to pave your way to get to the mountain, to get to Shechem, and hence it took a while. But on the ideal state, it is something which has to be done immediately upon entry. So that's the correlation with the covenant at Sinai and writing Torah on the rocks on a mountain with all the people partaking in that event. I want to propose another connection, and this may also raise another possible understanding of the significance of this ceremony. Let's focus on the issue of writing Torah, right? Writing Torah. Where else is there a command to write Torah on a surface somewhere? So here, I imagine, for those who are familiar, you can find a connection between what Joshua does here, following the command of Moses, and another famous command that is found in the book of Deuteronomy, and it appears twice in the book of Deuteronomy, once in Deuteronomy chapter 11, and then once again in Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is the first appearance and probably the famous one. We're all familiar with the famous verse, Shema Yisrael, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And within that pericope, we find the commands of teaching the Torah, right? And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them to your sons and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you walk on the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. And you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be for ornaments between your eyes. That's, according to the sage's interpretation, relates to tefillin, what is right, the phylacteries, those black boxes that are connected to your hand and on your head, right? Basically, that have within them Torah written. So you connect. This was taken literally. You connect the words of the Torah to your hand and between your eyes, right? On your head. And furthermore, and this is what I was referring to, and you shall inscribe them upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. This is the mitzvah, the commandment of mezuzah, what we find on our doorpost, on the entrance of all doors in our houses, right? The mezuzah, as well as on city gates. If you go into, let's say, the old city, which has its walls around and there's some gates. You go into the gate, you'll see that there's also a mezuzah on the city gates. So here I also find a similarity of writing Torah, just like they write Torah, right? There's a command to write Torah and connect it to your body physically, to your hands and to your head, which is basically symbolic of the idea that your thoughts should be guided by Torah and your actions should be guided by Torah. And furthermore, you should write Torah on your doorposts, the mezuzah. Your house should be a house of Torah, guided by Torah, not only the individual himself, but his family, his household, right? His house should be built on the premise of keeping the commandments of the Torah. And even furthermore, even the city gates, right? Upon your gates, not only your own personal house, but on a communal level, the city should be guided by Torah. So here we can find some similarity of writing Torah, but in the book of Joshua, the writing of Torah is on a mountain in the vicinity of Shechem. We saw the map, right, where they built the altar. In fact, and allow me just to do a slight tangent here and say that there was an altar found in the Mount Aval. In Google Maps, you saw when I pressed it, where it is a site, the site of Mount Aval, where one finds an altar. Here, look, I'm pressing now the Google, the altar of Mount Aval. Here, let's take a look. This heading from Biblical Archaeology Society, a biblical altar on Mount Aval and other Israelite footprints in the Jordan Valley. So there were findings. There is a massive site, obvious remnant of an altar. Most scholars agree that this was a place of religious ceremonies and animal sacrifices, and it's a very impressive archaeological find. It was basically pointed out by Adam Zartal, who dug. He noticed it in 1980 when he scanned the whole area of Samaria, and then dug there for a while during the 80s. And he claimed that he found the altar that Joshua built. So we have Joshua building an altar, but we also have him writing Torah. And the question is, why there? Why specifically in that area, Mount Aval, next to Shechem, right? The city of Shechem, Mount Aval, and not far from Mount Gerizim, which is also a holy site for the Samaritans. Why would Torah be written here? And I want to propose, and this is my novel suggestion here, that this ceremony is intricately connected to the writing of the Torah on the mezuzot, on the doorposts, and even on the physical organs of a person, on connecting Torah to his hands, to his arms, and his head. I want to claim that this is to be viewed as a national mezuzah. What do I mean? We know that Torah has to be written beyond your physical body, also connected to your physical body, also on your doorposts in your homes, and also on the doorposts of your city. So we move from the individual, family, community. What I want to suggest here is that what we have in this ceremony is setting up the national mezuzah, writing Torah on the doorpost of the nation. What is the entrance to doorpost of the nation? And here I connect with the question, why is this ceremony performed in Shechem? What's the significance of Shechem? Well, for that, we have to go back earlier on in history. The first Jew who is commanded to leave his home and go to the land of Israel, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. This is, of course, Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And Abraham does as he is commanded. And he takes with him his wife and Lot, and they move. They leave Haran, and they go to the land of Canaan. And where is the first place that they stop? verse 6 in chapter 12 in Genesis. And Abram passed through the land until the place of Shechem, until the plain, or I would say oak of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. First place that Abram reaches and stops is Shechem. And what does he do there? God appears and says, to your seed I will give the land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is Abraham, the forefather, the founding father of the people of Israel, who enters the promised land via Shechem and builds there an altar. The second forefather, Isaac, never leaves the land, but the third, Jacob, does. He goes and he flees from his brother Esau, goes to live with Laban, and then he returns. And after confronting Esau upon his return, where does Jacob go? And Jacob came safely, and I'm reading in Genesis chapter 33, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram upon his return from Aram, and he encamped before the city. By the way, what does he do? He buys a field there, and then there he erected an altar, and he named it, God is the God of Israel. 2 times we read of our forefathers who enter the land from abroad, Abraham and Jacob, and both of them, their first place in which they enter is Shechem, and they build altars there. Now I return to Joshua, when the Israelites finally enter the land, right after leaving Egypt, after the Exodus. They're commanded upon entry to do what? To go to Shechem. Why? Because Shechem is the entry point. Now, the Israelites had a miraculous entry via crossing the Jordan, right? So they didn't enter in a natural way. But the natural way is to enter from the north and then get to Shechem, a northern city in the mountains of Samaria. So the significance of Shechem is basically as an entrance point to the land of Israel. If you will, it parallels, right, the airport, Ben Gurion Airport. That's where people now, that's the entry site, the entry gate, right, in modern Israel. But in ancient times, the entry gate would be via Shechem. And as the entry gate to the country, this is the place where the national mezuzah, the national Torah writing on rocks, has to be performed. And it's done on the mountain, right, upon entry. And that is why it has to be done upon as early as possible. Because just like when you enter a house, you set up a mezuzah. When you enter the land, you set up the national mezuzah. You write the Torah on the rocks. The idea of law being written on the rocks on a mountain is not unique to Judaism. We also find it in Greek culture, where the custom was to place, right, stela or rocks with engravings of the law of the land. This was significant for establishing a location, a connection to a place. So too with the Israelites. This is what they were commanded to do upon entering the land. And hence we can say that this is basically the full circle of what we have in the other commandments. We have the tefillin command, right, connecting Torah to the individual. We have the mezuzah connecting Torah to your house and family, and to your city gates, to your community, and to your nation, to your country. This is the importance, and this is the significance of the covenant at Shechem. We see that this was a floating pericope. It appears in different places. It may very well be a Deuteronomistic redactive layer, which parallels what we find in Deuteronomy, but it goes back to the commandments that we find in the Torah and establishing the criteria for setting up the Israelite homeland. And that required, amongst other things, not only to ensure that the individuals, the families, and the communities live by Torah, but also the state, the whole nation, be a nation founded on the basis of the laws of the Torah. And this is indeed what was commanded, and this is what was done according to the book of Joshua after they had access to reaching that location of Shechem, the entry point, symbolic entry point to the land of Israel.